Now, moving forward into this, following Korea, following this mutually assured destruction, around 1956, 57 more or less, um, Eisenhower and Khrushchev announced what is called a peaceful coexistence. Okay, so what is meant by peaceful coexistence? Well, if you've seen those little bumper stickers in the car where it says coexist and it's got all the different religions forming the letters, it's the idea of, hey, as long as everybody's not hurting anybody, let's let everybody do what they want to. Okay, and so that was the mentality there. Um, in other words, the spirit of Geneva has been killed, as you see here. Now, what is meant by the spirit of Geneva? We're going back to that Geneva Convention, right? And the Geneva Convention, think about Korea. We had a split, everybody was fine. Can't we just go back to that? And so the spirit of Geneva is it is peaceful coexistence. It is to let communism and democracy coexist without sense of a war. In other terms, we also call it a Cold War thaw. Now, this is the first one. When Nixon comes to power after Kennedy and Johnson, we have a second one. Okay, so there are two Cold War thaws. The first one in the 50s, right? Now, this Cold War thaw does not last long because there are three episodes that kind of gain in kind of badness to end this peaceful coexistence, right? The first happened in Egypt. Now, we talked about the Panama Canal a ton, but there's actually an older canal called the Suez Canal through Egypt, and it's a very powerful canal because it controls everything going down into the Mediterranean. So if you control that communism, democracy, you can see where I'm going, right? Now, what happened is the Suez Canal is going to be threatened by its autonomy. Okay, autonomy basically means ability to rule itself. When the Egyptian president decides he wants to nationalize it, what that means is everybody who goes to that canal has to have the approval of the Egyptian president. Well, that seems a lot like communism, correct? So we don't necessarily get involved here, but Britain and France do. Britain and France long have been engaged in North Africa at this point. They're there after World War II. And so there comes a little battle between the Egyptian forces and then also, of course, the British and the French. And this is called the Suez Crisis because what happens is the Egyptians are calling on the Soviets to come and help them, and the British and the Americans are calling on them to come help them. Luckily, neither side really goes down to help, and we kind of just let the British and the French fight the Egyptians and figure it out for themselves. Otherwise, it could have potentially got far worse. And so that was the Suez Canal. It was over shipping. Eventually, Egypt does do this. They kind of morph into a semi-communist state, and we've been on rocky terms kind of since then. Now, the next thing, and I'm going to show you this because this is great, gives me one of my favorite all-time phrases because Khrushchev is crazy in and of himself. And that phrase, and I'll show you in the video later on, he basically accuses Nixon of trying to pull the wool over his eyes, if you ever heard that, or fool him. But he says, we will not swat flies with our noses, is what it translated to. And it's one of those moments like, what? But what happened is Vice President Nixon, yes, Vice President Nixon, that's who's there under Eisenhower, goes to Moscow for a event, for a kind of show. And the idea was, we're going to show how communism and democracy, their best benefits. And so we built model houses and we let everybody go through this expo and we let everybody look. Okay, that was the idea. Now Nixon goes, and as you'll see in the video clip, to talk about color TV. He talks about color TV maybe 16 times in the first minute. I might be exaggerating by like one or two times, but nonetheless. And Khrushchev is going to see this as an opportunity to kind of poke the bear, I guess you could call it, because he's trying to prod Nixon into saying something. And it's an interesting interview. I'll show you some stuff here and point it out. But what we call it in history is the kitchen debate, because a lot of the debate took place over what would be in a modern American kitchen. The washer, the dryer, the dishwasher, etc. To which at one point Khrushchev actually said, well, hey, are you trying to make the women lazy? But I mean, there was a big debate there. And so this kitchen debate is kind of more or less just a debate over what the things communism and democracy can offer the average household. No one really wins, but there it is. Now, really good stuff starting to happen here. In 1959, we have a Paris Peace Summit, and the idea was to end the Cold War. Yes, it could have been ended. Vietnam could have never happened. And so this is great, right? Now, as we're getting ready to sign it, or we're getting ready to kind of sit down and talk. I don't know if it's a pen going down. I don't think it was that intense. The Soviet delegation runs in and says, "Stop, we're done, we're leaving." And so the Americans are kind of dumbfounded, or so we act, right? The reason is we had a plane known as a U-2, not the band, but it was a U-2 spy plane. It flies at ridiculous high altitudes and takes reconnaissance, which is like looking down, how can we use this, spy pictures. And it was shot down in Moscow. Okay? So this is kind of a U-2 spy plane. We still use them today. Very cool. And here's the one that was shot down. The Soviets downed an American plane. The U.S. says it was a weathercraft. Khrushchev sees the summit as blown. He's talking, of course, about the Paris Peace Summit. And so the Paris Peace Summit essentially ends because of the U-2 incident. And the U-2 incident is where the Soviets shot down one of these spy planes, and they captured the pilot. His name was Francis Gary Powers. And if you go to Moscow today, they actually have the wreckage of the U-2 spy plane under a sign that basically says "Victories of the Cold War." And so they see this as a victory of the Cold War because they more or less proved that the Americans were spying on them when they were doing the same things to us. So I don't know if you would consider it a victory or not. Now, the next thing we're going to go into is Kennedy. In 1960, John F. Kennedy will become president. He is not Dwight D. Eisenhower. He actually kind of ramps up this idea, and it was some of the stuff Eisenhower had laid to waste, but Kennedy kind of took the ball and rolled with it, and we'll talk about that.